Welcome to European Tech Talks, a podcast brought to you by the European Champions Alliance. The ECA's mission is simple: support the growth and success of European tech companies in the global market. On this podcast, top tech experts and entrepreneurs from all over Europe will share their insights and actionable tips on how to thrive in the European tech scene and beyond. You'll also get the latest updates on the global tech industry and understand how they impact Europe. Three dynamic European women host your podcast. Andrea, the founder and soul of the ECA, hosting from Paris, France. Lucie, our marketing and communication junkie, hosting from Karlsruhe, Germany. And myself, Anne-Sophie, the tech and product aficionada, hosting from the Silicon Valley. Join us on this journey as we explore the vibrant European tech ecosystem. You can also connect with our thriving community by becoming a member, by following the ECA on LinkedIn, or simply by subscribing to our newsletter on our website. And now, let's jump right into today's episode.
So welcome to a new episode of the ECA Tech Talks, the podcast from the European Champions Alliance, where we talk with professionals from the European tech ecosystem about how to build European champions and how to build a great European tech ecosystem. And I'm so happy today to welcome Reinout to our podcast. Because we've been discussing for a long time doing this session today, and I'm really happy that you're here. Reinout, welcome to ECA Tech Talks.
Thanks, Andrea.
So, Reinout, so you're a partner at Tin Capital. So you're one of the big investors in cybersecurity in Europe, and I'm very happy and very curious to hear about your work and what you think about the European tech ecosystem, especially in the field of cybersecurity, of course. But before we jump into that, would you please introduce yourself and Tin Capital with your investment thesis and what you are doing?
Sure. My name is Reinout Vander Meulen, and I'm based here in The Hague, in the Netherlands. We've got another office in Amsterdam, and we're a small team, about 10 people strong. Tin Capital is a long-standing Dutch VC since 1998. I wasn't there at the time, of course. I was busy together with Bo and Bart, building our own startup back in the day in aviation IT. So again, not cyber, but Tin Capital was one of our investors at the time. And when we exited the company at the end of 2015 and stayed on for a few more years to secure the earnout, we were invited to join Tin and help them run their fourth fund at the time, which was the first thematically focused fund for Tin, and the topic of cyber was selected, and for good reason. I mean, cybersecurity is a problem that's not solved today. It won't be solved in 5 years either, because cybersecurity is a natural consequence of digitalization, and that wave hasn't come to a halt yet. So yeah, we picked that topic. We launched the first cybersecurity fund in 2019. That was a 36 million euro fund invested in the Netherlands, but also in France, in Portugal, in the UK, Belgium, Germany. And when we launched this fund a year ago, the European Cyber Tech Fund, which is a 100 million euro fund, we decided to focus more on Series A and more on Europe for a number of reasons. First of all, if you want to effectively deploy a 100 million euro fund, you just want to have some wiggle room. So we had to really look at European startups. We saw a lot of good quality startups as well in Europe. And we noticed that between Israel and the US, there was not that much attention going to European cybersecurity startups, not that much specialized funding vehicles. And we felt that there was an opportunity for us to lead in that space. We've evaluated the previous fund as extremely spot on in terms of topic, and yeah, we're excited to be here and very happy with the results that we've obtained so far with some of the portfolio companies that are doing extremely well, and at the same time also mindful of our position here in Europe about the geopolitical situation, the dominance of Israeli and US players in this space, and what strategy works for us and for European founders to still be successful in that high stakes arena.
So you've already touched upon it with, let's say, the power play between the different regions of the world, the US, China, Israel, especially US and Israel in terms of cybersecurity. So what we often discuss when we talk about funding in Europe is, of course, the famous funding gap that we have, or that people say that we have in Europe, meaning that we don't have enough capital to invest in cybersecurity or in any other startup, but we're talking about cybersecurity today. So what is your take on this? Do we really have a money problem?
I've looked up some numbers, first of all, just to kind of quantify a little bit what we're talking about. So the European Union is about 450 million inhabitants or so. And there were in 2023, I don't have the 2024 numbers yet, but 2023, there were 59 early stage cybersecurity investments. And early stage is everything including up to and including Series A. In Israel, which only has 2% of the inhabitants and about 9 million people, they had 38. So over half of that. And in the US, it's 300, 20 million or so inhabitants. They got 4 times as many, so 233 investments in cyber. So that kind of tells you that we're not really leading here in Europe. And this is on the investment side. But if you look at the market, then it's understandable that Israel invests heavily into its own security, right? They have a real security mindset and tradition, excellent talent and talent programs also in the army. But the real market's in the US. It's much, much bigger. So the customers are there. Customers have much more of a security mindset. They do spend more on security. They will take risks. They're happy to take risks with a small startup if that startup offers something that they need. Where in Europe, there's a real hesitation with governments and with larger enterprises to work with smaller companies. And if you look at the exit side, whether that's a strategic exit, well, all the players that have the M&A budgets to buy cybersecurity startups are pretty much based in the US. And if you look at the IPO opportunities, well, the of the US stock market is such that for a cybersecurity company, it's a much more attractive place to go public. And so there's quite a few factors at play here, and that makes the US really the Champions League of cybersecurity. And if a founder, no matter where they're from, by the way, but if the founder is building a company that's potentially category leading in cyber, there are quite a few reasons why they would prefer the US above Europe or anywhere else, really. And then I haven't even mentioned the size of the funding available in the early stages, so VC and angel funding. The size of the funds are typically quite a bit larger in the US. Here, a large fund is probably 400 or 500 million or so, whereby in the US, you commonly see funds that are much, much bigger than that. So that's the situation, Andrea. I mean, that is what it is. And geopolitically, you sometimes hear politicians say that we need to be very mindful of our strategic position. We need to retain talent and invest. But there's also an economic reality at play that is relevant for founders, it's relevant for investors, and that you can't really ignore.
So I hear what you say, and you would say, we have more inhabitants than the US. Of course, we are much more fragmented in Europe, so we know about all of the fragmentation topics that we have. But we have as many security problems as the US has or any other country.
Yes.
So the basis is basically much about the same, I would say. So the question is, and maybe, I don't know if you have the numbers at hand, but you say that there's much more investment in the US and also in Israel compared to the size of the markets. And on the other hand, we have the startups in Europe who say, oh, it's so complicated to raise money. It's so difficult. Many of our members come to us and they say, okay, we're trying to raise funds and we're trying to talk to everyone. And in Europe, no one wants to give us the money. So is it a question of risk taking on the money giver side, so on the investor side, or is it also a question of quality on the startup side of what is really in which kind of companies you could invest, and is there also less investment opportunity, you think, because there are just less cybersecurity startups that are built in Europe or of a less good quality, maybe?
So I don't think it is related to the quality of the startups. Definitely not the talents and the expertise that the founders bring. There's excellent people in Europe, obviously. VCs or investors are more risk averse in Europe. I think so, slightly, yes. There's just a cultural aspect to that, I guess. But I think the main problem, and this is something that founders sometimes don't really realize, is that so the offer a founder makes to an investor is really, I will offer you a stake in my company in return for investment so I can further build the company and work towards a successful exit for all shareholders. But the success they can achieve is limited by the space they're in. If you are playing in Europe and you have to compete against a very similar company in the US, purely because they have a larger market the US startup can serve, the outcome will be better. It's just as simple as that. So it is more difficult for European founders, whether they would be talking to a US investor or a European investor. That's really irrelevant, because if they're focusing on winning in Europe, they're just going to face so much more hassle and barriers in order to achieve. So it's going to be a more expensive and more difficult to achieve the same revenue or recurring revenue levels than a US company would have. So I think that's really the core of the problem, right? And that's also why you see quite a few European companies that are really doing well at some point move to the US in some way. And it could be that it's just a US VC that spots the opportunity and wants them to move their headquarters, right? For a number of reasons. It's not just the fact that it's the US market that's more attractive, but it's also if you want to exit the company or IPO the company, then that makes sense to have the headquarters in the US. It's easier for the US VC because they know US law, right? And for them, French or German or Austrian law is strange and uncomfortable. I mean, it's the same for us, right? I mean, we are investing in Europe, and the hassle we have to each and every time understand the particular national regulation, whether it's around tax or whether it's around corporate law, or it's just it's a hassle, and that's kind of, and sometimes there's additional costs. We have a portfolio of companies in many European countries, and it's very, very cumbersome for us to manage that. So yeah, we are confronted with the fact that Europe is a single market, but it's not, right? It really isn't.
It's not. And so, because I had this discussion recently, and the person I'm talking about will be also on this podcast, so it's interesting. It's a European who set up his cybersecurity company in the US, and I'm going to ask him about this journey. But is this then the final solution? I mean, I know that changing the market is going to be difficult, and it's going to take a lot of time, to have a little bit more risk openness in Europe, to make people more aware of those topics. So it's a question of years, it's going to take a lot of time. So to build European champions in cybersecurity, and this is basically what we're trying to work for, because we think that Europeans should be protected by European cybersecurity companies, ideally. What does it take then to do that? I mean, is the solution for all of the cybersecurity startups to say, okay, let's build a solution here and scale it in the US? I mean, not everyone is capable of doing that also, because it brings a lot of question and also operational, questions with it. Does one of the founders have to move to the US? I mean, is it like building in Europe but scaling in the US and then coming back to Europe? What would be also from your portfolio, what you see, what is the right way for the founders, and also the advice we can give to founders on how to bridge this gap between those two markets and still being able to build a meaningful company in cybersecurity?
There are a few things that I've seen that seem to work, right? And the first of them is very, very obvious. If a massive portion of the global market is in the US, you need to be able to sell in the US. Okay, that doesn't mean necessarily moving headquarters or anything. It might not even mean that you have to have a real presence in the US, although that can really help. But just ignoring that market is kind of strange, right? So many of our portfolio companies that are past Series A do serve US customers. Some have opened up subsidiaries in the US. Some are working with agents or partners. Some are going direct from Europe. It really depends on the offering and how capable the company is to do business, at a distance, or whether they need boots on the ground. Okay, so that's definitely one thing, right? The other thing to realize is that doing business in the US is very, very expensive, right? If you hire commercial people in the US, it's very normal to need to pay them $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year, excluding bonuses. Yeah, that is something that is expensive, and you need to be able to recuperate that investment. So you have to sort of really go after it in a way. And the second thing is that hiring developers in the US is also very expensive. Now, in Europe, it's not easy to find developers either, but it's a whole lot less expensive. So it could be very beneficial to have your tech teams in Europe and develop the solution here. It's much more economical. And then finally, there are certain areas where it's actually an advantage to be based in Europe, and where the main demand will be in Europe. And that's when it comes to compliance, because if there's one thing that we are good at in Europe, it's regulations. And we do see that regulations around privacy and cybersecurity originate here in Europe and are then typically a few years later picked up and implemented in the US, Singapore, and the UK. So you can actually have a head start in these areas if you set up a business here in Europe and make sure you capture the European market and then expand to other markets when the regulation follows there. Another one is, for instance, privacy enhancing technologies, or PET. This is something that we're also interested in. Again, in Europe, getting patient data unlocked and using it to train AI models, for instance. So that's just virtually impossible because of GDPR, and rightly so. Of course, this is very sensitive data. Now, with PET, there are ways around that. It is possible to extract value from those data sets without breaching the privacy regulations. And that is something that technically is only now becoming possible and beneficial for data custodians and data scientists that want to train those models. And I'm sure that once those startups here are successful, those models will be copied in the US and elsewhere. So yeah, so it's important, I think, as a European founder to really know where you stand in the global arena. You want to compete, but in order for you to win, you want to understand where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are and how you're going to address those. But
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so if you want to win in some of the more larger segments in cyber, you're going to have to face up to the Israeli-US competition at some point. It's unavoidable. And once you're ready to do that, then you'll have to deploy activities in the US. It may be necessary to work with a US investor and to leverage their expertise and their network. Yeah, I mean, go for it. Yeah. There's no real reason to refrain from doing that.
Well, the reasons that you can hear from the startup side, of course, is a question of money, because it's a big investment to go to the US, and not even talking about the developers, because I think you're right. But even if you're looking for, good salespeople or even partners, it's a big investment to go to the US. So very from a very operational point of view, would you then say that, I mean, let's say you're a Dutch startup or French or German, and you say, okay, build your product, make it have a product market fit, make it ready, expand a little bit in your home country, and before expanding to other European countries, understand the US game as quickly as possible and try to start selling as quickly as possible over there, understanding the market, how the buyers work, I mean, how the system works over there, and then basically scale it in the US and then use what you have done over there to more strengthen the European market?
Yes, I completely agree with that. If I think back at my own startup days, we were selling to airports globally. I mean, we were based in the Netherlands and there aren't too many airports in the Netherlands, right? So we had to, from day one, go international, right? And we knew that selling to the biggest airports globally will always have a spin-off effect. Because if you sell to Incheon Airport in Korea, to Hong Kong, to LAX, to Amsterdam Airport Schiphol, to London Heathrow, these are the big names in aviation, right? And there's going to be a whole lot of airports that are going to look at those large airports and basically copy what they're doing. It's just the same in cyber, right? If the big, large organizations or governments decide to work with vendor X, right? And if you are vendor Y in the same space, you're down 1-0, okay? You have to capture the market in the sense that winning those big customers early on is going to be very, very helpful to win a lot of followers, right? Smart followers that are looking at what the big players are doing and basically copying that. And if you're based in Europe and you're not going after those large US accounts, somebody else will. Because in cyber, a good idea is never unique. Well, it may be unique, but it's copied very, very quickly, right? And you see companies in the same space popping up around the same time, pretty much in the US, Israel, and Europe simultaneously, sometimes even. So if you don't go after that large US market and the biggest customers there, somebody else will. And if there's a real need for your product, then they're going to go with your competitor. So not going after the US market is basically giving up pretty early on in the race.
So, I mean, I understand this is the reality, right? On the same time, we would love our European entrepreneurs to concentrate about securing Europeans. So I see there's a kind of split between what we would like to have as Europeans and an economic and a market reality. So would you then say that as an investor, a startup that comes to you that says, okay, because basically you cannot do it all, right? You cannot develop the whole European market and the US market when you're a Series A startup. You just don't have enough, maybe the capacity or even the money. Would you, and somehow we have to bridge the gap between, benefiting from this market and in the same time building something in Europe that serves European customers. So would you then say that an entrepreneur who comes to you and who has at least the beginning of a good answer to both problems is someone that you would very much welcome, someone that has understood how to, play the European game and start developing the US market? This is something that you would welcome and support.
I would. Yeah, for sure. But the slight issue that I have with the geopolitical strategic autonomy argument that you hear in Europe, right, is that if it was really that important, right, you would expect European customers to prefer European vendors. And that sometimes happens, but not very often. Okay.
Yes.
So I much prefer a business that's actually going after customers and be successful in a true economic sense, rather than hearing the strategic autonomy argument, which is great for politicians, right? They really like to talk about that, but those same politicians often do not instruct their government organizations to buy European. And frankly, the French government will buy from French startups. Yes, that's true. But the same French government will not buy from a Portuguese or a Polish or a German. I mean, I'm being a little bit blunt here, but that's what I see. Okay. And this is where Europe is weakening itself, right? If Europeans would buy European startups would be in a much better space, but they don't. They just follow the market. And if you're looking for cloud security, they're going to buy Wiz. That's what's happening.
So this brings me to another question, and I think also my last question, because the other ones we mostly also gave the answer to, which gives a good introduction to the question of consolidation. Because, as I said, we are publishing our European startup and scale-up mapping now, and we have over 850 companies in this mapping, and we think that we only captured a fragment of the European market in this mapping for this time. So we think there are a lot of startups, and maybe one of the answers could be to have a European consolidation in a couple of segments where we have a lot of startups, like threat management, for example. There are really hundreds of startups in Europe in this segment. And if you say, okay, the French government wouldn't buy from a Polish or a Portuguese company, maybe the question of consolidation could be interesting, to have several national companies kind of consolidating into one bigger company, which could be a European champion. So how do you see the consolidation discussion? It would be interesting to have your viewpoint on that, also as an investor, because it's not always, every company has different investors, and then you have to get everyone together to build something new. And how do you see that?
Yeah, so obviously for us as a VC, having exit possibilities and more exit possibilities is very much welcomed, obviously. Now, for that to take place, you need to have strategic buyers with M&A budgets that fit the need. And there are currently not that many European buyers in cybersecurity with budgets exceeding 100 million euros. Or dollars. And if you compare that with the number of strategic buyers in the US that have M&A budgets exceeding that number, it's kind of clear where we are expecting, unfortunately, to sell most of our portfolio companies. And, we have done. We have, a couple of months ago, we sold a Portuguese company to Sneak, the SaaS company, the market leader based in the US. And I expect that to be a typical mechanism for us to exit our portfolio companies. In order to keep those companies, those startups, European, we need to have more strategic buyers in Europe. Now, how do you create more strategic buyers in Europe? There's a couple of ways to do it. First is the IPO route, to have very successful European startups that have the potential to become a large platform player, to get listed on a European stock market and stay here. While that's theoretically possible, we don't really see it happen at all, I think. And that's because the US stock markets are just much more attractive for those type of companies. So that's, it's unlikely, I think, to change. And then we have maybe a role for private equity, and that is possible. I do think that this will happen more often, that private equity will see an opportunity to build a European platform player. Will buy European startups and add these together to rival the Palo Altos of this world. But, I hear myself saying this, rival the Palo Altos of this world. This is not an easy thing to achieve, right? So, yeah, we'll have to see. But I think that this latter option is probably the most realistic way to exit promising cybersecurity startups in Europe and keep them European. The IPO route is I just don't see it happening. Well, that's it, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting insight, and thank you very much, because it's something that we're very much, thinking about at the European Champions Alliance, and, starting to see some possibilities, and we see it also as our role to engage into those discussions, looking at the reality. And it's not saying, okay, let's build the European champions in the economic reality that just is complicated in cyber, but still trying to inspire also European leaders to, first of all, build those companies and try to make them sexy enough for you wanting to invest and for customers wanting to buy the solutions. But then on the other side, also discussing with the buyers and to say, how can we make them more attractive, or how can we make the ecosystem more attractive, and to support those companies being where they should be, so that European buyers would also like to buy their products or even invest, in the CVC space. We can also have European companies investing in those cybersecurity startups. That's really interesting. And thank you very much, Reinout, for your, let's say, investor perspective, which is always a little bit different, of course, as the ones that the startups have, well, depending on the clarity and vision of the startup founder. This is really very interesting. And are you still, let's say, hopeful for building those European champions? Because you said, the wave of cybersecurity has not stopped yet. And I think there's still a lot of things to come. So are you hopeful for the future for our European champions and to have the European big players?
Well, I wouldn't do this job if I thought it was impossible, of course, right? It is challenging for sure. But as I said, I do see a lot of talent in Europe, right? So I'm optimistic about that. There are really enough people out there that can build an exceptional business. I'm a little bit less hopeful that they can do it just in Europe, right? Without having to take into account the US market, or it's not possible to build a segment leader and completely ignore the US market. I don't think that that's possible. But at the same time, we're also selling European cars in the US, right? And I think that's a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness. If you win in the US market, you show that you matter globally. And that's something to be really proud of. So for me, the US market is something that's, it's there and it's there for the taking. It's a massive challenge because you will face well-funded startups that are local to the US or are Israeli and have moved their headquarters. So it's not easy, but if you manage to do it, it's a true achievement. So, and I think it's possible. I really think it is possible.
So basically, think big, right? For the founders, think big, think strategically, have a bold vision for the startup, and call Reinout if you're looking for money and if you have a great product in cybersecurity.
Of course.
And come to the ECA if you want the ecosystem to help you build this European champion. So Reinout, thank you very much for your time today. And I'm looking forward to all of the discussions that we're going to have in 2025 and beyond. So thank you very much.
Likewise. Thanks, Andrea. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of European Tech Talks until the end. If you enjoyed it, please leave us a 5-star rating and share it with your friends and colleagues. This will help increase our visibility on the podcast platforms. And don't forget to subscribe to receive our latest episodes. Before you go, have you considered joining the European Champions Alliance? As a member, you will have access to a network of European companies and industry experts, exclusive publications on industry-specific topics, invitations to members-only events, and support and advice on your pan-European expansion plans. If you're interested, please visit our website at european-champions.org or reach out to us on LinkedIn. See you in the next episode.